Hello, good day. My name is Travis Bembenek. I'm the CEO and owner of Mexico News Daily. George, I got to tell you, my wife is happy that I'm making an effort to be increasingly less confidently wrong. I don't know about you.
Making an effort, but are you making any strides? That's what I would want to know.
I'll ask. I'll ask.
So today we are going to talk about Claudia Sheinbaum, the new president of Mexico, who has basically been president now. This is about the 1 year mark. So Travis and I thought it would be a good idea to just sort of jump in and sort of talk about what she's done, accomplished, public opinion of her after her first year in her presidency.
That's right, George. I think everybody remember a Mexican presidency, 6 years. So we're 1 year down, 5 to go. And I guess the other sort of framing I do at the beginning here is it's important to remember that one of the first of all, many Mexicans know her and know her well, right? She has a history of leadership in government positions in the country. She was the former mayor of Mexico City. And being sort of hand-chosen by AMLO, the thinking of many people was that she was going to, number one, follow his policies coming in, and number two, and this is not something I agreed with or I thought was really appropriate, but just the idea that she was going to be really AMLO's puppet. So she would be there, but he would be calling all the shots from behind the scenes. So I think what George and I want to do today is do a check on that statement. Was it confidently wrong or not? And just sort of, review her first year in office.
Yeah, and there's sort of been no evidence of that AMLO is, being her puppeteer behind the scenes.
I agree.
Sure, she did pass his judicial reform. I mean, it was already a done deal. It passed in whatever the House or Congress, and but it wasn't, I guess, formally approved until she was president. I think a lot of people were hoping that she would kind of backtrack on that, but she did follow through on it. But besides that, I haven't really seen any evidence of him behind the scenes being her puppeteer. Have you?
I agree with you. I think it's important to remember how confidently wrong people were leading up to AMLO's presidency, right? I mean, they were predicting an economic collapse. Basically Mexico becoming the next Venezuela, currency collapse, things like that. And so a lot of those voices were the same ones suggesting, she was just going to be a figurehead and that AMLO would really be running a shadow government, with her as the face of it. And I agree with you. He always said he was going to move to his ranch in the countryside. He did that. Now, again, arguments could be made. Well, what about his kids? Are they involved in government? But just I think at face value, it's quite safe to say AMLO pretty much has drifted off into retirement.
Which is also sort of reflected in her current approval rating, too, right? I mean, she has, roughly a 70% approval rating right now, which is as high as basically any sitting president in the world. I think Modi in India and Bukele in El Salvador might be the only two other presidents that are even close to her approval rating. So, right. There's something to be said for that.
Yeah, I think it's not only that. One is the approval rating, right? Usually a president's anywhere, highest approval rating is when they win, and then it's pretty much a steady decline down, right? And she won in the mid 50% of the votes, and it's only been,
and now is up around 70. Exactly.
Yeah, and so that's one thing to point out. And I think the other thing is the fact that as we look at politics and societies around the world, many of them are pulling further apart, right? So the electorate is becoming more polarized and sort of more angry and with the other side. And Mexico, I think that's why the Claudia Sheinbaum case study is so interesting, because Mexico's one of the few countries, I would argue, in the world where there's more uniting going on than dividing. It's not perfect, but it's definitely the trend.
I agree with that. And also, she was handed an enormously difficult situation when she became president, right? You had Trump getting elected, not at the same exact time, but, in the infancy of her presidency. I mean, she was appointed or inaugurated in October. Trump became, inaugurated in January, and Trump immediately went on the rampage against Mexico, whether that was through tariffs or sanctioning Mexican banks or trying to rename the Gulf of Mexico. And
border policies, drug policy, yeah.
Yeah, and also dealing with the new Prime Minister of Canada. I mean, all very, very challenging things to deal with right as soon as you get elected president. And I sort of think, especially with the way that she's handled sort of the U.S. rhetoric, I think she's done an amazing job. And I don't know, I know this isn't supposed to be opinion-based, but I just don't know of another leader in the world who could have handled those situations as well and as eloquently as she did. And I think that also has a lot to do with why her approval rating went from 50 up to now 70. The way she handles herself, whether you agree with her politics or not, she's hard not to like.
I think it's a good point. Go ahead, George. Sorry.
No, that was it. I mean, every time, she has to respond to all of these things coming out of the U.S., she just does a great job. She never gets sort of emotional. She never lashes out. She handles it with integrity and intelligence. And, I think there's a lot to be learned, from her on the way that she has handled it.
For sure. I think it's important just to point out to our listeners that this isn't a podcast today where we're just going to talk about why we think Claudia is doing great or why we don't think she's doing great. What we really want to do is just highlight sort of the challenges she faced upon beginning her term and the challenges she's faced during her term in this first year to help equip you better to decide how you think she's doing. One thing I hear so often from American friends here in Mexico is they say, I think she seems to be really a charismatic person. I like what she's doing. I like how she's holding her own on behalf of Mexico against Canada and the United States and China. But I often talk to Mexicans and they can't stand her and I don't understand it. I'm confused. And so what George and I are going to try to do today is just sort of help you think that through. And I think, George, you touched on it, but it's not only that she faced new leadership in both Canada and the United States, but in both countries, the new leaders came in with a mandate for major change, right?
Totally.
And in the case of the United States, Trump, again, some would argue if he had an overwhelming mandate for change, but he certainly thinks he did, and he's running the government as if he did. And arguably Mexico was in direct line of fire of a lot of those changes, right? So whether it's border policy, immigrant policy, the way to handle cartels, the way to handle trade. I mean, tariffs, trade, China, so many issues coming right at this new administration in Mexico, day one, basically, even before day one, that they were coming at them.
No, totally. The other thing too, which I think is just awesome, is she's the first woman president of Mexico. And that's not an easy, those aren't easy shoes to fill, as you're then, all that lies on you, and you're representing, women in Mexico being the first woman president. And I just think that's awesome. And it's
and that point can't be stated enough. Yeah, that point can't be stated enough, George. I mean, I remember a year out from the election, or a year and a half. Again, I have Mexican friends in the U.S. and Mexico that I speak with daily. And I heard dozens of times from smart people that I respect and have a lot of experience. I heard there's no way a woman could win presidency of Mexico. I heard that. I also heard there's no way the military would respect a woman leader in Mexico. So the fact that she made it, not only she made it, but the two final candidates were women from the two parties. And then the fact that she won and she's been thriving and gaining more approval as she goes is really, you can't say it enough in terms of respect. And I think and a sign that the country's changing a lot faster than people think.
No, that's a great point. So let's talk about just some of her initiatives that she came out with in January of 25. One of which was Plan Mexico, which we'll talk about a little bit. And one of the other big ones was the Pensión Mujeres, which we will also talk about. But let's sort of dive into just Plan Mexico and what that is. I've got a list, Travis, but if you want to go through your sort of points of it, or I can certainly go through my list if you want.
Yeah, I mean, even without going through a list necessarily, I think that the easiest way to understand Plan Mexico is it's Mexico's version of Make America Great Again, in its simplest form. So in its simplest form, what it is we are in an increasingly uncertain world economy, world geopolitical environment, and it means we as Mexicans need to build a plan for ourselves, right? And that means, more self-sufficiency, more investment in ourselves and not relying on suppliers from around the world, and just really challenging the country and the business community to invest in Mexico and think differently than they had in the past.
Yeah, one of the first sort of line items of her Plan Mexico is to make Mexico one of the top 10 economies in the world by 2030. And I think that's sort of the gist of the whole platform. And then, right. She goes on to say she wants to increase combined public and private investment above 25% of GDP, rising to 28% by 2030. Incredibly lofty goal. This is also why it's fun to talk about this now and sort of point these things out, because if me and you are still friends in 5 years, we can sort of go back through these and analyze what she came back with or how it ended up. She's also trying to create an additional 1.5 million jobs, specializing in manufacturing and other strategic sectors. She, like you said, she is really focusing on increasing local content and domestic production, especially in strategic value-added sectors. And an example, 15% increase in national content in automotive, aerospace, and pharma. And then she also wants to meet the domestic needs.
Okay, George, goods. There's 100 points in Plan Mexico. You're not going to read them all, are you?
No, there's 13. And I'm only reading 7.
No, but there's more. There's a total of 100 points.
Well, this is the summation of it, Travis. I'm trying to give people an idea who may not know. Not everybody's a genius like you, Travis.
All right, please continue. Thank you.
Ensuring 50% of domestic consumption in sectors like textiles, footwear, furniture, and toys is satisfied by local production, going back to your point, making Mexico more self-sufficient. And I thought this was interesting, just reducing the time required to finalize investment projects from 2.6 years to 1 year, which I think in Mexico, stuff takes forever sometimes. And I think that's sort of an important goal to focus on when you have these cool projects that you want to do. Let them not get bogged down in these lengthy approval processes. And then
let me stop you there a minute, George, because I think...
Sure.
Or go ahead. You have the last one. I'm sorry.
The last one. This is it. See, there were only like 8. And then ensuring that 30% of small and medium-sized enterprises have access to financing, which I think this is huge because I think a lot of sort of just Mexico and Mexicans initiatives I just think it gets stagnated with the lack of financing options, the difficulty to get financing here in Mexico. So focusing on that to really boost these small and medium-sized enterprises, I think, is an incredible initiative if it works. And that's it.
That's the point, though.
That's all I got.
It's a plan, right? And so anytime a politician has a plan or a political party has a plan, instantly there's cynicism and attacks from the other side. And so I've heard a lot of leading Mexican voices, economists, politicians, analysts saying, well, we still have a great plan, but the plan isn't necessarily being executed to the speed they want. I think it's important to step back on this, and there's two big things Sheinbaum did differently from day one than her predecessor. The first one was she recognizing the changing world, recognizing, and I'll call it a threat from the United States, economically, politically, and so many issues.
Totally.
She engaged, number one, the business community. She said, and that's very different than what AMLO did. She made a real effort from day one to engage the business community and did some real tangible things to do that. So she put Altagracia, who's a leading businesswoman in the country, in charge of basically a business panel committee that reports into her of leading business people. The head of the American Chamber of Commerce is on that, and other big business committees. But she made clear, I'm going to need you, business community, to go forward. The second thing she did was engage the international community, right? And that's very different than AMLO. So AMLO, again, proudly didn't really travel outside the country, said, I'm only going to focus on Mexico. She rightly, I believe, recognized from day one, if the U.S. is pushing hard on Mexico, Mexico's going to need more friends, right? Both, geopolitically and economically. So right after she was elected, she went to the G20 meeting in Brazil. She was invited to Canada for a G7 meeting, and she went. And she not only went, but she went and flew an economy class on commercial airlines, which may have sent an interesting signal as well to the electorate about her priorities.
Well, AMLO sold the plane, so she didn't have a choice.
Exactly. She was left with some tough choices. But I think I just want to get those 2 points across. She engaged with the business community, and she engaged with the international community in a way that was a step change, different way than her predecessor had done. And I think that's been a hugely important thing for her to do.
And she's also kept, on the lines of trying to reduce poverty that sort of AMLO started, and came up with the Pensión Mujeres plan, which is basically, it's sort of like lowering the retirement age, but in a different plan, right? Where she is going to basically give about 3,000 pesos, which equates to a little under $150 every 2 months. So that's not much. Right. It's only $75 a month, but that means a lot to a lot of people. And this is geared directly toward women between the age of 60 and 64 who, may have been not involved in sort of the work world per se, but, dealt with all of the domestic stuff, whether they were running a household or, and they may not have a typical pension, or they may not have access to that sort of stuff, having not been in the work world. And, she is not only proposing, but has actually now implemented this plan to give women between the age of 60 and 64 this sort of, this bi-monthly or every couple months stipend. And those little initiatives also have a dramatic impact on pulling people out of this poverty level, which I think she wanted to continue when she saw what AMLO had done in the past. And Yeah, I think it's, I
Yeah,
think
it'd
it's
be
great.
easy, George, for a lot of our readers to just say that's vote buying. At the end of the day, that's giving handouts to buy
Totally.
votes, right? And
Right.
I think that that's wrong, and I'll tell you why. I think, and a lot of Mexicans would suggest that as well, that they're just
Well, but,
basically
hey, tell me
buying.
what you told me. You told me the story the other day when you were in Oaxaca, with the woman who was one of the women, I think,
Yeah.
getting that stipend. And tell me that story again,
Yeah, I
and
think
your
again,
discussion.
a lot of us maybe from the U.S. have this immediate reaction when we think of welfare programs. We think, well, wait a minute, I don't necessarily believe in paying someone not to work or in being lazy or becoming dependent on the government. And so we have that sort of initial visceral reaction to that. I think a lot of people in the big cities in Mexico feel that way as well. But I think that misses the point that there is still a massive amount of poverty and very little social net for a lot of people in this country. And so I think you got to recognize, you mentioned this Oaxaca example. In states like Oaxaca in the south, the second poorest in the country, if there isn't a move to invest more in those states with infrastructure or programs, and if there's not social programs, people have very little choice than to leave. And oftentimes, if they're willing to leave their hometown and their home state and leave behind their family and friends, they're not just going to stop in Mexico City. They're going to keep going north and they're going to go to the United States, right? I mean, we've seen that time and time again. And so I think what this administration has recognized with young people, but also the elderly, is that there needs to be more of a social net to support these people. So whether it's, you specifically mentioned the one for women, and it's this idea that even if you weren't officially working in a workplace and as a result don't have a pension, you still did a lot. You worked and supported your family. And so there's this token amount of money to support and provide the basics. You mentioned it's $150 every 2 months. There's a similar program for parents that have kids in school. It's about $120 every 2 months. Not a handout, not a vote buy, although some would say it is. What it's intended to be is a recognition that the educational system doesn't provide everything the kids and parents need. Books, school supplies, uniforms, toilet
So
paper.
are you gonna tell the story about Oaxaca or no?
Well, so I mean, I'm going to write about it actually, but I met a young woman, about a 30-year-old woman and her husband, both work full time in Oaxaca. Her two brothers were farmers, and ultimately, when there's a bad year and a drought, you make no money. And so they moved to the United States, and she stayed behind. And they have one daughter, an 8-year-old girl, and she talked to me about and she proudly showed me this card where she gets
So that's
$120.
okay. I thought she was in the 60 to 64
No,
age
she's in
bracket.
this
So
one.
it
She
was the
talked about
other
her mom.
program. Yeah, so it was the other program that AMLO did before he left.
Yeah. I
Okay,
guess the
anyway,
bigger point
no,
is
but anyway, go on, because I loved the story and
yeah,
it made
so
me understand it. That's why I want you to tell it.
yeah, so she proudly showed me this card that's automatically filled with $120 every 2 months that she has to, is intended for her to support her daughter's education. And I said, okay, I'll be honest. If I'm from Mexico City, I'm thinking this is just a handout. And how do I know you're going to actually spend it on your daughter? And I was just being provocative in saying that. And she was downright offended that I would suggest that. And she said, you have no idea. She said, our school doesn't have toilet paper. I have to buy toilet paper for my daughter to bring to school. She said school uniforms, any school activities. If they want to do any activity, it's not included in the price. That has to be paid for. School supplies. And she said, so this has been something that has made a real difference in my ability to ensure the best education possible for my daughter. And it was very personal. And I think to suggest this is just sort of vote buying, of course there's cases where where people aren't using these funds the way they should be. But I think in general, and that's why probably AMLO's biggest legacy is going to be raising so many people out of poverty. These direct transfers to people are working in improving the lives of people, and they see it and they appreciate it, and that's part of the reason why Morena's doing so well.
Totally. But you do, I don't think it's vote buying, but, me and you have talked about this in the past. I mean, that woman now gets that card, getting whatever, $120 every couple months. Do you think it's possible that woman is not going to vote for Morena in the upcoming elections? Whether that's a bad thing or not, I don't know, but, of course she is, right?
Yeah, and I called her on that. I said, do you see yourself voting for other parties? And she said, to be honest, the other parties basically didn't care if I existed or not. That was her exact quote. And she said, they wouldn't care if I just left the country and went and cleaned apartments in the United States. They didn't care. And so for the first time ever, I feel like there's an administration that cares about me and my family. So again, we can be cynical about that, but when you talk to people, and that's just one example, I spent a lot of that trip just talking to local people and understanding, their motivations around politics, given what's happening in the country. And it's real and it's powerful, and I think more importantly, the opposing parties need to think about what's going to be their platform, right? Because the cheese has changed. The cheese has moved in the country.
And to get elected as a new party, you're going to have to, at least promise that you're going to continue to do those sort of programs because it was demonstrated by them to sort of be successful. And I don't think you stand a chance to get elected if you don't.
Yeah, and I would say it a little differently. It's not just those programs. It's you're going to have to demonstrate that you're not going to neglect those geographies and those people. However that is. It doesn't have to be handouts. It could be jobs. It could be spurring investment. It could be infrastructure. But it's got to be something. The days of forgetting those people and those geographies seem to be over in Mexico.
Well, I've lived in Mexico for a long time, and I've traveled all over Mexico. So, I've seen those types of communities that you're talking about. But, typically if people come down here, whatever, and they go to Tulum or Puerto Vallarta or Mexico City or San Miguel, they don't sort of see those communities that you're talking about. And don't see the true need, for those people in those regions for, that assistance and help.
Right. Or on a 5-day vacation to Mexico City, you're seeing, 2% of the city,
You're seeing 2% of the city, which happens to be the 1% of the entire country. You're hanging out in Condesa, Polanco, Roma, and that's the 1%. It's not a clear indication of what the rest of the country is experiencing and going through.
Exactly. So, George, let's get back just quickly to this point of how can it be that so many Americans, when they talk to Mexicans, they're hearing that they don't like Claudia, right? Given everything we've covered, given the fact that she came into a difficult situation, she's kind of rallied the country, she's rallied the business community, she's reconnected with the international community. Let's just talk about that a minute. I'm sure you've heard it as well, where people hear from their Mexican friends they can't stand her.
And we just talked about it a little bit. I mean, where are those people going? They're going to Mexico City, Puerto Vallarta, San Miguel, and it's the more sort of affluent Mexicans and business leader type Mexicans that sort of don't like Morena. And if you're in those areas where you're dealing with more affluent people, affluent Mexican people, the odds are that they're going to say, oh, I hate Morena, blah, 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 this and that. And I think that's why I think if they went to the areas that you're talking about, outside of those places in whatever, Oaxaca, Chiapas, if they started asking the Mexican people, the responses would be very different.
That's right. And I think, one thing I do when I challenge people is to think of it's easy to just focus on Mexico and say, well, I don't like that she's doing X, Y, and Z, right? I acknowledge and I appreciate that she's doing A, B, C, but I don't like X, Y, Z. And what I try to say is, first of all, remember that no politician that would ever win an election would do everything you like, right? They've got to do some things that you like and some things others like. And so by definition, you're not going to like everything they're doing. And the second thing is, look at the bigger perspective of what's going on in the world. Look at the leadership in the United States, in Canada, in Brazil, in Argentina, UK, France, Germany. You can go on. And the electorate is increasingly polarized. And that's just the reality of the world we live in. And so what I try to debate people on is say, with that context, how do you think Sheinbaum is doing, right? Because it's easy to just get so fixated and micro on the local issues, which of course are important, but sort of forget this bigger trend happening in the country. And I think, if you look at, and I'll just touch on a couple quick ones. I mean, the economy in general, nobody's happy with the growth rate of Mexico. Mexico's growth rate is terrible. It's essentially zero. And given the fact that it's on the United States doorstep, that's just unacceptable. Mexico should be, in a bad year, growing 2 or 3% and should be striving to grow its economy 3 to 5% a year. It's not doing that. That being said, foreign direct investment continues to hit record highs. So that's something positive. The peso did weaken when Claudia first began. It's now getting stronger again. Who knows what's going to happen going forward? But the peso has been, I would say, steadily strong. It hasn't done anything dramatic under her watch. And I think some of the strides she's made...
It has strengthened pretty dramatically under her watch.
Recently,
not
especially.
right out of the gate, but when Trump was inaugurated in January, I mean, the peso was, 20.87 or something like that. And last week, it was strengthened down to 18.22 at one point. I mean, that's pretty dramatic. Exactly.
The other big indicator I watch for is just her relationship with the Trump administration, right? And again, when I debate Mexicans who don't appreciate, I think, what Claudia's faced with, I say, think of just Canada and Mexico, right? The closest neighbors and friends. And look at how Canada has handled the relationship and the Trump administration's responded, and compare that to Mexico. Right, and arguably Mexico's even more reliant on the United States than Canada is, and I think if you look at the way she's maintained respect, maintained dialogue with both Canada, she didn't have to throw Canada under the bus. On the contrary, she's further developing that relationship, while at the same time engaging with the different leaders of the Trump administration and making tangible progress. And those aren't my words. Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, was just here, had glowing things to say about what the administration's accomplishing. Long ways to go. But, in general, feeling like Mexico's on the right track.
And that's not easy. That is not easy what she's up against.
That's right. Kristi Noem from the Department of Homeland Security was in Mexico City meeting with Sheinbaum recently. Tough words from her on what Mexico needs to do, but also some positive commentary on what Mexico's doing.
Because
we don't have time here to get into all the details, but there's been a lot of tangible progress, very different than AMLO, in issues that matter to the United States, whether it's immigration, whether it's cartels, whether it's fentanyl, whether it's the trade relationship with China. Sheinbaum's administration's been taking tangible steps, not only to help Mexicans via Plan Mexico, but to maintain and hopefully improve the relationship with the United States. And that's not an easy task at all.
Totally. You bring up an interesting point, because last week or 2 weeks ago, Mexico came out and said that they were going to start imposing tariffs on Chinese goods, right? And everybody said that she is caving to the whim of the United States, and that's the only reason she's doing it, right? However, if you look at her Plan Mexico, which was released in January of 2025, it is, it's clearly a part of that plan, right? To strengthen Mexican products, to do all of that.
I think it's a great example of people being confidently wrong when they oversimplify that decision she made as saying she's just being pressured by Trump. Right? The auto and auto parts industry employs more than 1 million people in Mexico. They're generally high-paying jobs. They're distributed throughout the country, huge value add. And the world has seen over the last couple years when you let Chinese auto imports in unchecked, what happens? On one hand, you could argue low-cost, electric, high-quality vehicles come in, which has its positives. But on the other hand, it devastates the local auto industry. And
Totally.
Some countries, if they don't have a big auto industry, maybe they don't care and they just see the upside. Mexico does have a large auto industry, and those are jobs that, rightly so, she wants to protect. I think the added benefit that it also is in alignment with what the United States and Canada is doing is just a good thing. But to just say, well, she's just doing it to appease Trump is an oversimplification. Of course, that's part of it. Of course, the USMCA negotiations are coming up, and that's going to be a dicey, negotiation. But she's been pragmatic. I guess I'd say one other thing is, again, it's really important for those that just lump Sheinbaum in with AMLO and say, well, it's Morena. I don't like Morena. Just to recognize how different she's been. I mean, I mentioned Altagracia leading the business community. She also put Ebrard, Marcelo Ebrard, as really sort of the champion and the connector with the business community. And he was running against her. And so she took someone who's respected by the business community, was one of the negotiators of USMCA in the first Trump administration, and put him in one of the most powerful positions of her administration. That says something, and that
says she has critical thinking skills.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, how do we sum this up then? You first.
I would just say, and it's again, I've talked about it a little bit. When you're analyzing Sheinbaum, you got to look at the bigger picture of what's going on in North America and what's going on with the world. And you can't hold her to a standard that everything she does I have to like or I won't like her. That's just wrong. It's naive. It's ignorant to think that way. So you got to put yourself in her position, in the country's position, and see the way she's handling it. And I think if you do that from the bigger picture of what's going on in the world, in the leading economic 20 countries of the world, it's hard to argue she's not doing a hell of a job so far 1 year in.
Well, isn't life just more fun in general if you try to focus on the positive instead of the negative, right? I mean, honestly, there's things that I don't like about Morena, obviously, and there's some policy stuff about Sheinbaum that I don't like, but, overall, I think she is hard not to like, and I think she's done a great job for, all the things that we've talked about. And I would just encourage people like you just did to just be more open-minded and, get all of the facts and just don't dismiss her out of the gate because she's Morena and not your party.
Well said, George, and something you touched on, I think, is a great place to end is if you just even turn the volume off when you watch her, and just look at the optimism she exudes, right? She has a smile. She gets close with people and hugs them and high fives them. And if you turn the volume up, even if you don't understand Spanish, you just can't help but be inspired by her. And in a world where there's so much negativity and polarization, someone who, even if you don't agree with all of her policies, day in and day out, clearly works hard, exudes optimism and really tries to be close to the electorate, I think deserves respect. And so,
No,
I just
I
say,
agree.
when you hear from your Mexican friends, things, challenge them. They might be confidently wrong as well,
Come
right?
up with
Just
your own
because,
opinion based on what you read instead of just listening to one person.
exactly. Exactly. So it's going to be fun to watch. I would encourage you, even if you don't speak Spanish, follow her social media. It's probably the best social media I've ever seen to just show what she's doing. And it just kind of shows every day what she does. And it's hard not to have some respect with just the tenacity and energy and optimism she has. So it's going
Yes,
to be
just
fun to watch. I feel really fortunate to be in Mexico and just be sort of a part of what she's doing.
yeah, just basically try not to be confidently wrong.
Well said. Well
All
said. And
right.
that applies to you too, George.
Sometimes I am. Sorry. All right.
All
Thanks,
right.
Travis. Good talking to you, man.
Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.